The moment Minnie Carter stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, as if the dust-choked streets and weather-beaten storefronts had been waiting for exactly her kind of stubborn, clear-eyed courage to arrive and shake them loose from their long slumber. She was 26 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet, a worn leather satchel in one hand, and a trunk of medical supplies being unloaded behind her by a grumbling driver who had spent the better part of 3 days testing the limits of her patience. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, but there was something about the way she squared her shoulders and took in the muddy street, the saloon noise already spilling into the morning air, the horses tied at various posts, and the suspicious eyes of the townsfolk watching her from doorways and windows, that made her seem considerably larger. She had come from St. Louis, where she had studied medicine under Dr. Harold Vance for 4 years, working in his clinic, learning anatomy and pharmacology and the art of stitching wounds that should have been fatal. Dr. Vance had taught her that healing was not a gift but a discipline, and that the body, given half a chance and the right help, almost always wanted to survive. She had also, in St. Louis, lost her mother to a fever that a better supplied clinic might have managed, and that loss had settled into her bones as something harder than grief. It had become purpose. When she had read the letter from the Caldwell Town Council advertising for a physician or medical practitioner of any qualified description, offering a modest stipend, a small building for a clinic, and the promise of a town desperate for care, she had written back within the hour. The council had been expecting a man. They had received Minnie Carter. The mayor of Caldwell, a stout and florid man named Gerald Hobbs, was waiting for her at the base of the stagecoach steps. He had his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that suggested he was working very hard to look welcoming rather than alarmed. "Miss Carter," he said, extending his hand with the practiced warmth of a politician. "Gerald Hobbs, we received your last correspondence." "I confess we had not anticipated a woman," Minnie said pleasantly, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "I am aware. I have the letter of qualification from Dr. Harold Vance of the St. Louis Medical College, my certification of study, and 3 years of clinic experience. I am also, Mayor Hobbs, the only person who answered your advertisement in 6 months, so I trust we can dispense with the portion of this conversation where you question my credentials." Mayor Hobbs blinked, then let out a short laugh that seemed to escape him before he could stop it. "Fair enough, Miss Carter, fair enough. Welcome to Caldwell." The clinic building turned out to be a former harness shop that smelled of leather and old oil, and had a ceiling low enough that taller visitors had to duck beneath the central beam. Minnie walked through it with her sleeves rolled up and her bonnet off, making notes in a small journal about what she would need, what could be salvaged, and what had to go immediately. By the time the mayor left her there with a key and a somewhat apologetic smile, she had already mentally rearranged the entire space 3 times. Her nearest neighbor was a woman named Pearl Dawson, who ran a dry goods store next door and who appeared in the clinic doorway within 20 minutes of the mayor's departure, carrying a pot of coffee and a look of frank assessment. "You're the new doctor," Pearl said. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 40s with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water. "Town's been buzzing since your letter arrived. Half of them think it's a scandal, a woman practicing medicine. Other half are just grateful someone's coming who can do more than pray over a wound." "Which half are you?" Minnie asked. Pearl smiled and set the coffee pot down on the window ledge. "The practical half. I've got a bad knee that's been swelling since February. You want to take a look?" That was how Minnie Carter began in Caldwell, Kansas. Within the first week, she had seen to Pearl's knee, lanced an infected tooth for the blacksmith, set the broken wrist of a 12-year-old boy who had fallen from a fence, and quietly and carefully treated a woman named Clara Biggs for injuries that were not accidental, and which Clara insisted repeatedly had come from a fall, though both she and Minnie knew the truth of it. Minnie treated Clara with the same careful attention she gave every patient, and she pressed no harder than Clara could bear. But she made sure Clara knew that her door was always open, day or night, and she meant every word of it. The town adjusted to her presence with the grudging speed of a place that needed her more than it was willing to admit. The men were the last to come around, which she had expected. Cowboys and cattlemen and gamblers and laborers were a specific kind of proud, and that pride had a particular stubbornness about seeking help, especially from a woman who looked at their injuries and infections and poorly managed wounds with the unsentimental practicality of someone who had seen worse and fixed it. She heard about Roy Fletcher before she ever met him. She heard about him from Pearl first, who mentioned him in the way people mention a landmark, something that had been there long enough and survived enough weather to become simply part of the landscape. The Fletcher Ranch is about 8 miles east, Pearl told her, the second week after Minnie arrived. Roy Fletcher runs it, has done since his father passed 4 years ago. He's got 2 ranch hands, a herd that's respectable for this territory, and a reputation for being the most self-reliant man in Comanche County. Self-reliant how? Minnie asked, not particularly interested but polite. Pearl gave her a look that suggested the question was more interesting than Minnie realized. He fixed his own broken ribs last winter, Pearl said, taped himself up with canvas strips and kept working. Tom, one of his hands, told me Roy came in from the north field one afternoon pale as milk and moving like his bones were made of glass, and when Tom asked what had happened, Roy just said a fence post had gotten the better of him and went to the cook stove to start dinner. Minnie put down the jar she was labeling. He taped his own broken ribs with canvas strips. That is what I said, and continued working. 3 more weeks of the same, from what I heard, before they healed enough that he moved like a regular person again. Pearl shook her head, but there was a complicated admiration in it, the kind you have for someone who is genuinely impressive and also genuinely exasperating. That's Roy Fletcher. He'd sooner set fire to his own hat than walk into a doctor's office. Minnie went back to her labeling. Well, she said, we all come to it eventually. She met him for the first time at the Mercantile on a Thursday morning in late April, though she did not know who he was until afterward. She was examining a bolt of muslin cloth to use for bandages, and he came in through the door with the particular economy of movement that very competent men in physically demanding work tend to develop, every motion efficient and purposeful, nothing wasted. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something that had no interest in softening. He wore a battered hat and a canvas work coat and boots that had been resoled at least twice, and there was a long healing cut on the back of his left hand that was doing reasonably well, but could have benefited from proper closure 5 days ago. He glanced at her briefly as he moved toward the counter, the kind of glance that acknowledged another person's presence without inviting conversation. Minnie looked at his hand. She could not help it. It was the particular affliction of her training that she saw injuries first and people second, at least in the initial moment. That cut should have been stitched, she said. He stopped, looked at her with pale gray eyes that held the steady, unhurried quality of someone accustomed to reading weather and livestock and distances. It's fine, he said. It was fine 4 days ago, Minnie said. It's closing unevenly now. You'll have a bad scar on that knuckle and you may lose some flexibility in that finger if the scar tissue pulls the tendon. She paused. I am the town's physician, Minnie Carter. If you come by the clinic, I can address it. He looked at his hand, then back at her. Something crossed his face that was not quite dismissal and not quite interest, something more careful than either. Obliged for the information, he said, and turned back to the counter. She learned afterward from Pearl that it had been Roy Fletcher. Did he seem injured at all? Pearl asked. Just the hand, Minnie said, and pride, which is considerably harder to treat. She thought about him perhaps twice more that week, the way you think about an interesting problem that you cannot solve from a distance, and that has not yet come close enough to solve itself. Then the spring brought its usual parade of emergencies and ordinary ailments, and she filed Roy Fletcher in the back of her mind under stubborn men who would come to her eventually, the way they all did. What came first was not Roy Fletcher, but a situation that involved him. On the second Friday of May, a young man came riding hard into Caldwell just after noon, his horse blown and his face tight with controlled panic. His name was Danny Ray's, and he was one of Roy Fletcher's ranch hands, and he pulled up in front of the clinic because Pearl had run out to flag him down when she heard the horse and saw his face. "There's been an accident at the Fletcher place," Danny said, sliding off the horse. "Cattle gate collapsed while some of the herd was moving. Walt, the other hand, he got caught. His leg, I think it's bad." Minnie was already moving, pulling on her coat and reaching for her satchel. "How bad?" "His boot was on wrong when I left. The leg, I mean. It was." Danny stopped, swallowed hard. "It was wrong." "How long ago did this happen?" "Maybe an hour. I rode fast as I could." "How far to the Fletcher ranch?" 8 miles. "I can take you on my horse. It's faster than—" "My horse is in the stable behind the clinic," Minnie said. "Saddle it. I need 2 minutes." She spent those 2 minutes filling her satchel with everything she thought a compound or badly displaced fracture might require, including laudanum, chloroform, splinting materials, suture thread, and clean cloth. She tied it to the saddle when Danny brought her gray mare around, mounted with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up on horseback in Missouri, and said, "Lead the way." They rode hard for most of those 8 miles. And Minnie used the time to prepare herself mentally for what she might find, running through the anatomy of the leg, the likely positions of a fracture from the kind of gait collapse Danny had described, the complications that arose when a fracture went untreated for an hour in the field. The Kansas landscape opened up around them, impossibly wide under a sky that was blue and absolute. The spring grass greening the flat ground with the tentative brightness of a territory that had survived another hard winter and was not quite ready to believe in warmth yet. The Fletcher Ranch appeared on the horizon as a cluster of buildings, modest and well-maintained, the kind of place that said its owner worked it with his own hands and took a steady, unsentimental pride in the result. There was a main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a corral, and beyond it the long, flat reach of grazing land with cattle moving in the middle distance. Walt was in the barn, lying on a bed of clean straw that someone had hastily assembled. He was a compact man of about 35 with a weathered face and the particular gray pallor of someone in serious pain who was working very hard not to make noise about it. His left leg was wrong, as Danny had said. It was wrong in a way that Minnie identified immediately as a displaced fracture of the tibia, and possibly the fibula as well, but not, on initial assessment, compound, meaning the bone had not broken through the skin, which was the only piece of good news she had. Roy Fletcher was kneeling beside Walt with his hat off and a look on his face that was strictly controlled but not controlled enough that Minnie couldn't read the worry behind it. He looked up when she came through the barn door. "You're the doctor from town," he said. It was not quite a question. "Minnie Carter," she confirmed, moving past him to kneel beside Walt. "Mr. Walt, I need to examine your leg. I am going to be honest with you about what I find." She looked at Walt steadily. "Can you tell me if there is any feeling in your foot?" Walt's jaw was tight, but his eyes were clear. "Some. Hurts considerable." "That is actually good news," Minnie said. She conducted her examination with quick, sure hands, assessing the displacement and the integrity of the skin and the circulation beyond the break. Roy Fletcher watched from where he knelt, and he did not ask questions or offer commentary, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. Most people watching a medical examination either asked too many questions or offered advice based on something they had seen someone else do once, and neither of those things was helpful. "The tibia is broken and displaced," she told them both. "The fibula may have a fracture as well. I won't know for certain without a cleaner look, but the skin is intact. I need to reduce the fracture, which means returning the bone to its proper position, and then splint it. It will be extremely painful." I have laudanum which will help and chloroform if needed. Walt said, do what you need to. She glanced at Roy. I will need you to hold him steady. Can you do that? He met her eyes. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, but a recalibration of something. Yes, he said. She gave Walt a measured dose of laudanum and waited the necessary minutes for it to take hold, talking to Walt quietly about the ranch, about the cattle, about nothing in particular. The gentle misdirection of attention that Dr. Vance had taught her as clearly as he had taught anatomy. Walt talked about a particular cow who had given them trouble all winter, and by the time she finished talking she had administered the chloroform and Walt was unconscious. The reduction was the hard part, technically and emotionally, and she did it with the focused deliberateness that Dr. Vance had drilled into her, moving the bone back toward its proper alignment with the steady, controlled force that the procedure required. Roy held Walt still and steady throughout, his hands firm and careful, his face impassive though she could see the effort of it. When she was done and had the leg splinted and bound, she sat back on her heels and let out a slow breath. Her hands were perfectly steady, which she noted with satisfaction. Will he walk? Roy asked. His voice was quiet. If he keeps off it properly for the next 6 to 8 weeks and doesn't develop an infection, yes, she said. I will come out every few days to check on him. He cannot be moved to town, the journey would be too rough. She paused. He will need to stay here. He lives here, Roy said, and she heard something in that too, not just information. A slight emphasis on the word here, as if Walt's belonging on this ranch was something he felt clearly. Good, she said. Then he is already home. She checked her work, cleaned up, washed her hands with the clean water Danny had fetched from the house, and then began packing her satchel. Walt was beginning to surface from the chloroform and Danny was beside him, talking to him quietly. Roy Fletcher was still watching her. You've done that before, he said. A fracture reduction. She fastened the clasp on her satchel. Many times, the principle is the same, the particulars vary. You're from St. Louis, he said. She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him directly since she arrived, really looked, rather than assessed a situation around him. He was looking at her with that same careful, unhurried quality she had noticed in the mercantile, but now there was something else in it. Not quite curiosity, something more guarded than curiosity and more honest. St. Louis, she confirmed. You, born here, he said. Well, 30 miles south of here. Came to this land when I was 22. Been here 6 years. She did a quick calculation. That made him 28, 2 years older than her. You have a good ranch, she said, because it was true. Something passed quickly across his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the shape a smile might take if it decided to show itself, which it did not quite do. Thank you, he said. She visited the Fletcher ranch every 3 days after that for the first 2 weeks of Walt's recovery, then every 5 days as his leg progressed. Walt was a good patient, obedient and patient, which Minnie privately found remarkable for a cowboy. But Roy explained that Walt had broken his other leg 10 years ago and had a healthy respect for what could go wrong. Roy was there for every visit. He was always doing something when she arrived, always moving, always occupied with one of the 1,000 tasks a working ranch generated in an endless supply. But he stopped what he was doing when she came, and he asked after Walt with the straightforward concern of a man who thought of his hands as more than employees. On her 4th visit, she was examining Walt's progress when she noticed that Roy was favoring his left side in a way that she had not seen on the previous visits. She said nothing until she had finished with Walt and given him her assessment, which was good. The fracture was knitting with satisfying cooperation. Then she stepped out of the barn into the bright May afternoon and Roy was there, turning from the corral fence. She said without preamble, "What happened to your left side?" He went still. It was the stillness of an animal that has registered something unexpected and is deciding how to respond. "Nothing that needs attention," he said. "How long has it been bothering you?" "Miss Carter, I ask because you have been moving differently today than on my last 3 visits," she said. and you are standing about an inch left of where your weight naturally wants to be, which suggests you are distributing away from something painful on your right side, not your left, which is the side you are most obviously favoring. He stared at her. You are protective of your right side, she said. The left lean is compensation. What happened to your right side, Mr. Fletcher? A long pause. He looked out at the corral where a dark bay horse was moving in slow circles. Then he looked back at her. Took a horn, he said, from the cattle. During the same commotion with the gate, nothing broke. Are you certain nothing broke? I've had broken ribs before, he said. This doesn't feel the same. But something is wrong. Another pause, longer this time. Bruising, he said. Some, maybe more than some. May I examine it? The look on his face was something she had seen before on men who had just been asked the one question they had been carefully avoiding for days. A combination of resistance and the faint, exhausted relief of someone who has been managing something on their own for too long. I am a physician, she said, not unkindly. I have seen injuries of every kind. I am asking because I want to help, not because I am curious, and not because I think the less of you for being hurt. Being hurt is not a failing. Ignoring it until it becomes something that can't be fixed is considerably more of one. The words landed clearly. She saw them land. All right, he said quietly. She examined him there in the afternoon light, and what she found was not simple bruising. There were 2 ribs on his right side that were cracked, not fully broken, but compromised enough that one good jostle or hard breath at the wrong angle could push them past cracked into something worse. There was also a bruise along his lower ribs that was the deep, spectacular purple of serious trauma, and it was clear he had been working through it for at least 5 or 6 days. You need to take it easy, she said, knowing even as she said it that it was more or less useless advice for a man running a ranch alone while his only experienced hand was laid up with a broken leg. I have a ranch to run, he said, just as she expected. I know, she said. But if those ribs shift and puncture anything inside, we will be having a much worse conversation than this one. She looked at him steadily. I will bind them. It will help stabilize. And I will leave you with specific instructions about what you should and absolutely should not do. I trust you can follow instructions. I can follow instructions, he said, with a dryness that was not quite sarcasm but was definitely something. She bound his ribs with proper strips of cloth, working around him with the practical focus she brought to everything, explaining what she was doing and why. He was still, the way he had been still during the reduction of Walt's fracture, but this stillness had something different in it. A self-consciousness he was clearly trying not to show. When she was done, she stepped back and told him to breathe, and he did, and the breath was visibly freer than the ones before it. She saw the relief move through him and watched him notice her noticing it and watched him decide not to comment on either. Anything else, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How much do I owe you? The same rate I charge everyone, she said. Come by the clinic when you are in town. He nodded. There was a pause that was different from the ones before, less guarded, less managed. Thank you, Miss Carter, he said. You are welcome, Mr. Fletcher, she said. She rode back to Caldwell with the late afternoon stretching long golden shadows across the grass and something that was not quite thoughts, not quite feelings, but some combination of the two that she did not immediately examine, turning quietly in the back of her mind. She told Pearl about it that evening, sitting in Pearl's kitchen with coffee that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. He took a horn during the accident, Minnie said. 2 cracked ribs. Was working through it for 6 days without a word. Pearl shook her head slowly. Lord above, I know. What did he say when you found out? Minnie considered. Not much. He let me treat it. Pearl looked at her with those creek-water eyes. That, Miss Carter, is significant. Roy Fletcher letting a doctor touch him is about as common as spring snow in June. Minnie cupped her coffee mug. He is very stubborn. He is, Pearl agreed. He is also a good man. His father was the same. Works himself past the point of sense but would give you his last dollar if you needed it. Never seen him treat a soul badly. Not a hand, not a native trader that comes through, not anyone. She paused. He had a hard few years. The ranch is doing better now, But when his father died and left him the debt along with the land, it was touch and go for a while. He sorted it himself. He would, Minnie said. You like him, Pearl said, with the pleased certainty of someone who has been waiting to say exactly that. I don't dislike him, Minnie said, which was not the same as an admission, and both of them knew it. May turned to June, and the territory turned with it, the grass deepening and the heat building with the slow, implacable patience of a Kansas summer that intended to be thorough. Caldwell buzzed with the business of a cattle town in season, cowboys coming off trail drives looking for everything they had been missing for months, merchants doing their best year of business, saloons loud into the small hours. Minnie's clinic was steadily busy. She went out to the Fletcher ranch twice more for Walt, and both times Roy was there, and both times he came to check on his hand's progress and stayed for a conversation that had begun, by the third visit, to feel like something that both of them looked forward to, though neither was saying so. He asked her about St. Louis. Not in the polite, cursory way people made conversation, but with actual interest, as if he was trying to understand how a person ended up where she had, and why, and what it meant about them. She told him about Dr. Vance, about the clinic, about her mother's death, and how it had crystallized the vague intention of her work into something specific and driving. She told him about the letter from Caldwell and writing back immediately, and the mayor's face when she stepped off the stagecoach. He laughed at that last part. It was a real laugh, brief and honest, and it changed his face in a way that startled her slightly, the way unexpected warmth in cold weather startles you. I expect it was something to see, he said. He managed admirably, she said. By the second week he was actually proud that they had a woman physician, though he did not recall that he had been alarmed about it initially. People come around, Roy said. Most of them, she agreed. You are not what I expected, he said after a moment. There was something careful in it, an honesty he was choosing rather than arriving at by accident. What did you expect, she asked. Someone more. He paused, looking for the word. Performative, he said finally. Like they had something to prove. You don't act like you have something to prove. I don't, she said. I know what I can do. What would be the point of performing it? He looked at her for a moment. No point at all, he said quietly. It was the middle of June, when Caldwell had its first genuine medical emergency of the warm season. A trail drive came through from Texas with a man named Holt, a drover of 40 or so, who had been bitten by a rattlesnake 4 days prior, and had been treated on the trail with the usual combinations of cutting and whiskey that were applied to snakebite with tremendous confidence and highly variable results. By the time he was brought to Minnie's clinic, he had a badly infected arm, a fever that had been climbing for 2 days, and the glassy, disconnected look of someone who was fighting something systemic and losing ground. She worked on Holt for the better part of 3 days. She drained the wound. She cleaned it with carbolic acid solution. She managed his fever with cold compresses and willow bark preparation. She sat with him through the delirious hours when he talked to people who were not there, and tried to get out of bed to attend to duties that existed only in his fever. She had Danny Rays, who had come into town for supplies, carry a message to the Fletcher ranch explaining that she might not make her scheduled visit for Walt, and asking if they could wait 5 days. The message that came back was brought by Roy Fletcher himself, who arrived at her clinic door on the second day of Holt's crisis. She heard the knock and opened it, and he was there with his hat in his hands and the direct, uncomplicated quality she had come to recognize as simply the way he was. Danny gave me your message, he said. Walt says to tell you not to worry about him, the leg is doing fine, and I came to ask if there is anything you need. She stared at him for a moment, surprised by the offer in a way she probably should not have been, given what Pearl had told her about him. Come in, she said. He came in. He looked at Holt, who was sleeping in the back bed, and at the basin of water and the cloth and the jars and implements of 3 days' work. He looked at Minnie, who was, she was quite aware, somewhat disheveled from 2 days of very little sleep and continuous effort. Is he going to make it? Roy asked. "I believe so," she said. "The fever broke this morning. The wound is cleaner. He needs another day or two of monitoring. Is there someone to help you? Pearl has come by. She does what she can." Roy nodded slowly. Then he said, "Can you sleep if I stay and watch for a few hours?" She opened her mouth to say that was not necessary, and she was perfectly capable of managing. Then she looked at him and saw that the offer was entirely sincere, and she thought about the hour she had last slept and how her eyes felt like they were full of sand, and she closed her mouth again. "If anything changes," she said, "if his breathing becomes labored or his color changes, come and get me immediately." "I will," he said. She slept for 4 hours in the small back room of the clinic, on the narrow cot she kept there for long nights, and when she came back out, Roy was sitting quietly beside Holt's bed with a hat in his lap and a watchfulness that had not flickered. "He's been still," Roy said, "breathing easy. Temperature feels lower when I checked his forehead, like you showed me." She felt something warm move through her chest that she identified, with clinical precision, as gratitude, and with somewhat less clinical precision as something else. Holt recovered. By the 4th day he was sitting up and eating, and by the 5th he was driving the nurses, of which there was only Minnie, to distraction with requests, which she considered an excellent sign. Roy had gone back to the ranch by the 2nd day, but he had stopped by on his way out of town to check, and she had told him that things looked good, and he had nodded and said he was glad, and there had been a pause before he left that felt like it wanted to be something and wasn't quite yet. She thought about that pause on several of the subsequent evenings, in the quiet hours when the clinic was empty and the town had settled into its nighttime rhythms, and she examined it with the same honest attention she gave to medical problems, which was the only kind of honest attention she knew how to give. She was attracted to Roy Fletcher. That was simply factual, and she was not a person who had much patience for dressing facts up as something else. He was a serious, careful, self-sufficient man who had one of the more functional people-reading intelligences she had encountered, who treated everyone around him with a steady decency that seemed entirely natural rather than performed, and who had sat by a sick stranger's bed for 4 hours because she needed to sleep, and who had not once since their first meeting questioned her competence or her right to practice medicine in Caldwell. The question, which was the more interesting one, was what he felt. She was not, in the general run of things, a woman who waited for men to act first. She had never had the temperament for it. But she was also a woman who had spent 4 years learning to read situations carefully before intervening, and what she read in Roy Fletcher suggested that whatever was there, and she believed something was there, it was in the process of its own slow and careful deliberation, and that pushing it would not help. She could wait, she decided. She had waited for harder things. July was hot and dry and full of incident. A fire broke out in the livery stable, and 3 men suffered burns of varying severity, and Minnie spent a brutal day treating them with the cool, organized intensity that she had discovered. She summoned best in genuine emergency. A child broke a collarbone in a fall. A traveling salesman arrived with what he described as a cold, but which was clearly pneumonia, and she kept him in the clinic for a week and got him through it, though it was close on the 3rd day. Walt Fletcher came to the clinic for his final examination in early July, walking on his own with a careful gait that she watched with satisfaction, noting the symmetry and the strength of it. She gave him her assessment, which was positive, and a set of ongoing exercises that she had put together from what she knew of rehabilitation, and told him he could return to light work within the month. "Roy will be pleased," Walt said. He had a slow, thoughtful way of speaking that she had come to enjoy. "He's been working himself half to death with just me and Danny and things going wrong with the fence in the north field. Tell him to come to me if anything is wrong," she said. Walt looked at her with a small, knowing smile. "I'll tell him," he said, in the tone of a man who was saying something slightly more than the words suggested. Roy came to the clinic on a Thursday afternoon in late July, and he knocked on the door and came in with his hat in his hand, and she could tell the moment he crossed the threshold that he had been deliberating about this visit. Not because of an injury this time. He was moving normally, his color was good, and his eyes had none of the careful blankness she had learned to associate with him managing pain. "No emergency," she said. "No," he said. "I wanted to," he stopped. The words were not coming easily, and she saw him acknowledge that fact with a slight tightening of his jaw. "I wanted to thank you, for Walt, for coming out there that first day and for every visit after. He's back on his feet and the ranch is right again, and that is," he paused again. "That mattered to me a great deal. I wanted you to know that." She folded her hands in her lap. "I know it," she said. "You did not need to come in to tell me." "I know I didn't need to," he said. "I wanted to." A silence opened up between them that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has substance to it, the kind that says something in itself. "How are your ribs?" she asked. "Healed," he said. "Completely. Good." Another silence. He was looking at her with those gray eyes and the careful, considering quality that she had come to feel like she could read a little, though she was not entirely confident. He was working up to something, and she had no intention of making it harder or easier. She just waited. "I wondered," he said finally, with the directness of a man who has been preparing a sentence for some time and has decided the only way through it is straight, "if you might like to have dinner in town at the hotel dining room, if you would like that." She let herself smile. It was a genuine smile, not managed, not calibrated, just the real thing. "I would like that," she said. Something in him settled visibly. It was the smallest change, just a fraction of the tension going out of his shoulders, but she saw it. "Saturday evening," he said. "Saturday evening," she agreed. He left 5 minutes later, and she stood in the middle of her clinic looking at the closed door for a moment before she turned back to her work, and she was still smiling. Pearl, who seemed to have a supernatural sensitivity to developments in Minnie's personal life, appeared within the hour. "Roy Fletcher was just in," she said from the doorway. "He was," Minnie said. "He looked different when he came out, less like he was about to argue with himself." Minnie put down her pen. "We are having dinner Saturday." Pearl made a sound that was half pleased laugh and half something more complicated, more tender. "Well," she said, "that is something." "It is dinner," Minnie said. "That is all it is yet." "Of course," Pearl said, entirely unconvincingly. The hotel dining room was the best Caldwell had, which was not Paris but was, on a Saturday evening with the light coming through the windows at the right angle and the smell of a decent roast in the air, genuinely pleasant. Roy was already there when Minnie arrived, standing by the table in a clean shirt and his best coat, his hat in his hands, and when he saw her come through the door something moved across his face that she thought, honestly, was the most honest expression she had ever seen on him. She had worn her good blue dress, the one she had brought from St. Louis and rarely wore in Caldwell because there had not been much occasion. Her hair was down, which she rarely wore in the clinic, pinned back but full at the sides. She saw him register these things with the particular attentiveness of a man who does not notice much that is not worth noticing. "You look," he stopped, started again. "You look very well," he said, which was not quite what he had started to say, but she let it stand. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They sat and they ordered, and the conversation started with the careful tentativeness of two careful people finding their way into uncharted territory. But it was easy, easier than it had any right to be, because they had already established the rhythms of honest speaking with each other during those weeks of visits and Walt's crisis, and those rhythms came back quickly, like a road you have traveled before even when the light is different. He told her about the ranch and his father. His father had been a man of the same build and same economy of movement, he said, and had come to Kansas from Missouri before Roy was born with a plan and a stubborn patience that had eventually produced the ranch out of raw land through nothing but consistent hard work over 20 years. Roy had grown up on the land and learned it the way you learn anything you grow up in, not all at once and not formally but deep and completely, so that you carry it in your body. When he died, Roy said, and the straightness with which he said it told her that he had made peace with the grief though it was still present. There were debts I did not fully know about. The ranch was not in the position I had thought. I spent 2 years working out of them. Alone. Walt had been with my father for 15 years, he said. He stayed. We didn't talk about it much. He just stayed. She thought of that, the particular loyalty of it, and then she thought of Roy sitting by Holt's sick bed, watching through the afternoon with no complaint, and understood something she perhaps had not fully understood before. You are a person who is very clear about what matters, she said. He looked at her for a moment. I try to be, he said. I don't always get it right. Neither do I, she said, but I also try. They talked through dinner and long after, until the dining room had emptied around them, and the waiter was beginning to make the subtle noises of someone who would very much like to go home. They walked out into the Caldwell evening, which was warm and full of the insect sound that came with Kansas summer, and he walked her back toward the clinic the long way around without either of them deciding to do so. At the clinic door they stopped, and he was close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the place on his jaw where the stubble came in heavier on the left side. He was looking at her with an openness that was new, something that had not been there in all the earlier visits, something that had come through the evening and landed here, present and clear. I have not done this in some time, he said quietly. Done what? She said, though she suspected she knew. Wanted to, he said, which was all of it really. She leaned up and kissed him, brief and certain, the way she did most things. His surprise was immediate, and then his response was too, one hand coming up to the side of her face with a gentleness that she would think about later, in the clinic's quiet, as possibly the most careful thing she had ever felt. Good night, Mr. Fletcher, she said, stepping back. Roy, he said, please. Good night, Roy, she said, and went inside. August in Caldwell was not a gentle month. The heat was absolute and the cattle trade was at its peak, and the town's population swelled and shrank with the movement of drives and the life of the trail, and Minnie's clinic ran at a pace that left her genuinely tired at the end of most days. But there was something different about being tired in August than there had been in April, something that had to do with a reason to look forward to Thursday evenings, when Roy came to town for the week's supplies and always stopped at the clinic, and to Sunday afternoons, when the pace was slower and they rode out together into the territory, just the two of them, talking and quiet by turns. She learned him in pieces, the way you learn anything worth knowing. She learned that he read, which surprised her, though perhaps it should not have. He had a small collection of books in the ranch house, science and history, and one dog-eared volume of poetry that he owned but denied reading. She spotted the poetry book on his table on one of her visits and mentioned it, and he looked at the book with the expression of a man encountering an acquaintance in an embarrassing context. She did not push it. She just noted it. She learned that he was deeply fond of horses in the specific way that some people are, the way that is less about utility and more about something genuine, a kind of respect for the intelligence and will of an animal that carries you. He talked about his horses the way other men talked about their land or their children, with specifics and pride. She learned that he had a sense of humor that was so dry it sometimes took her a moment to find it, but when she did it was worth finding, sharp and quiet and genuinely clever. She learned that when he was uncertain about something he went very still, and when he was certain he became more efficient, that the quantity of words he spent on something was in inverse proportion to how sure he was about it. He learned her too. She saw him learning her, the same patient attention turned in her direction. He learned that she was not, in spite of her surface practicality, a person who lived without feeling. She felt things deeply and precisely, and the practicality was not a wall but a container, a way of keeping the feelings functional rather than overwhelming. He figured this out, she thought, during a Thursday afternoon when she told him, briefly and without asking for comfort, about her mother's death and the fever clinic that could not manage it, and he sat with that information without rushing to fix anything or deflect from it. Just let it sit there between them as something real, and that was exactly what she needed. He learned that she found the territory beautiful in a way she had not expected, the flatness of it, the sky that went on further than any sky she had ever seen before, the particular quality of the light at the end of the day when it turned the grass golden, and the whole vast plain seemed to glow from inside. On a Sunday afternoon in the second week of August, they rode out past the edge of the Fletcher Ranch's northern fence and dismounted at the edge of a dry creek bed, where a cluster of cottonwood trees made a shade that was the most welcome thing in the world in that heat. The horses drank from the trickle of water still running in the creek center and stood in the shade, and Minnie and Roy sat against a cottonwood trunk and talked about nothing important for a while. Then Roy said, "I want to say something, and I am not entirely sure how to say it." "Try straight," she said. "It works for you." He looked at her, and the openness she had seen in him more and more since the evening at the hotel was entirely present now. No guard, nothing managed. "I think I am in love with you," he said. "I have been thinking about that for the better part of 2 months, trying to be sure that it was true before I said it, because I don't say things I am not sure of. And I am sure of it." The cottonwood leaves made a sound above them in the dry breeze, a soft, papery sound that she would always associate with this moment after. She looked at him. "I think I am in love with you too," she said. "I came to the same conclusion some time ago, but I was waiting for you to catch up." He stared at her for a moment. Then that rare, complete smile came, not the precursor to one but the real thing, and it changed his whole face, and she thought, not for the first time, that Roy Fletcher was a remarkable-looking man when he was happy. He reached over and took her hand carefully, like something worth handling with care. She let him hold it and leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that in the cottonwood shade, while the Kansas afternoon went on around them in its vast and unhurried way. The weeks that followed had the quality of something that had been building for a long time and was now, at last, able to simply be what it was. There was nothing dramatic about the shift, no grand declaration, no change in the fundamental nature of either of them. They were the same people they had been, only the distance between them was different now, closer in the way that matters, the kind of close that has to do with being known. He called her Minnie, which she had told him to do, and she called him Roy, and those small exchanges of names had a warmth to them that she had not entirely anticipated. Names, she thought, were underrated. There was a great deal contained in the way a person said yours. She met some of the wider Caldwell community through Roy, or rather, through the community's relationship to Roy, which was one of quiet, established respect. He was not a social man in the way of someone who sought company, but he was present and reliable in the way that counted, the kind of man a town depended on without always acknowledging it. When there was a fence dispute between two neighboring ranchers that threatened to become something uglier, Roy had mediated it by going to both ranchers separately and talking with them in the same quiet, direct way he talked to everyone, and the dispute had been resolved without a single shot fired or a lawyer involved. Minnie found herself hearing this story from 3 different people in the same week, which told her that the town paid attention to Roy Fletcher even when he did not think it was paying attention. She told him this and he looked uncomfortable. "People talk too much," he said. "People talk exactly enough," she said. "It is called community." He had no immediate response to that, which she took as agreement. September brought a change in the air, the first cool edges in the mornings that suggested autumn was considering its arrival. The cattle trade wound down, and Caldwell settled back toward its off-season rhythms, slower and quieter, the inflated summer population contracting back to its year-round core. Minnie had been in Caldwell for 6 months. She had in those 6 months delivered 3 babies, treated a range of injuries and ailments from the mundane to the genuinely life-threatening, lost 1 patient, the pneumonia case who had seemed to be recovering, and then declined sharply in the night before she could reach him, which she carried with the particular weight a doctor carries every loss, not consuming but present. She had established herself firmly enough in the town's regard that even the most stubborn skeptics of female medicine, of which there had been several, were at least no longer actively dismissive. She had also fallen in love with a Kansas rancher, who taped his own broken ribs with canvas strips and read poetry in secret, and held her hand like she was something worth being careful with. On an afternoon in the middle of September, Roy came to the clinic in the middle of the week, not his usual visiting day, and she knew before he knocked that something was different because Danny had ridden ahead to say Roy was coming, and Danny's face had the look of someone carrying difficult news at a careful distance. She opened the door and Roy came in, and he was carrying something, not physically, but in the set of his face and his shoulders, something that had weight. "Sit down," she said. She sat across from him and waited. "I got a letter today from a land agent in Wichita," he said. "There is a question about the title to the northeast pasture, about 140 acres. My father bought it from a man named Calloway in 1871. Calloway apparently sold it to two different parties and the other party is now claiming the land." She took this in. "What happens if the claim succeeds?" "The pasture is where I run the best of the herd in spring," he said. "Losing it would not kill the ranch, but it would hurt it significantly, and there is a cost to the legal process that he stopped. That would strain things." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. "Have you the original deed?" "I have it. And documentation of payment. My father kept good records. I have what he left." "Then you have a case," she said. "It may need a lawyer, but you have a case. Wichita has courts." "I know." He rubbed one hand along his jaw, a gesture she had come to recognize as his version of uncertainty. "I wanted to tell you. I don't generally tell people when things are difficult." She looked at him with a steadiness that she meant him to feel. "I know you don't," she said, "and I am glad you told me." He looked back at her, and the trust in that look, the deliberate choice to be open about something hard, was not a small thing. She understood what it cost him. "It will work out," she said. "I believe that." "You don't know that." "No," she said, "but I have observed that you are not a man who is defeated by things that can be fought, and this can be fought." Something in him quieted, the way she had seen him quiet before when something settled back into proper order. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly, without preface, in the way he had said "I think I am in love with you" in August, with the solidity of something he had already verified and was simply reporting. "I love you," she said back, just as plainly. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, and she watched the top of his dark head bowed over her hand, and felt something inside her settle with a permanence she recognized, but had not known before this. The land dispute took 3 months and a Wichita lawyer and 2 trips that Roy made to the city, while Minnie ran the clinic and Walt and Danny ran the ranch. The original deed held. Roy's father's records were clear and well documented, and the other claimant's case, which had relied on a deliberately duplicated and vaguely dated sale document, collapsed under the examination it received. The northeast pasture remained Fletcher land. Roy came back from the final Wichita trip on an evening in December, when Caldwell was dusted with the first real snow of the winter, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold. He came to the clinic first, before the ranch, though the ranch was the more logical stop after an 8-hour wagon ride. Minnie opened the door and he was there, the snow in his dark hair, the lines of a long day on his face, and something in his eyes that she read as the particular relief of a man who has carried a load for a long time and has just set it down. "It's done," he said. "Come in," she said. "Come in, you must be frozen." He came in and she put coffee on, and he sat at the small table in the back of the clinic and told her everything, the last hearing and the judgment and the drive back through the snow, and she listened to every word of it and asked the right questions. And when it was all told, she got up and came around the table, and he turned his chair, and she sat in his lap, and his arms came around her with the settled completeness of 2 people who have arrived somewhere they intended to be. "Thank you," he said, against her hair. "For all of it. For listening every time I came back from Wichita tied in knots and needed to." "You never came to me tied in knots," she said. "You came to me composed and told me things very calmly." "I was tied in knots under the composure," he said, and she laughed, which she could feel vibrate through his chest, and felt him smile against her hair. They sat like that for a while, the clinic warm around them and the snow outside making the world quiet, and it was one of those moments that she would carry forward into the rest of her life as something she could return to when she needed it. In January of 1883, on a cold Sunday afternoon at the Fletcher Ranch, with a fire going in the front room and Walt and Danny thoughtfully absent, Roy asked her to marry him. He did it without a great deal of ceremony, which she would not have wanted, and with a great deal of care, which she would and did. He had been building toward it for a week in the way she could always feel him building toward things, the slight increase in attentiveness, the particular quality of his silences. He had also, she discovered later, spoken to Pearl in advance, not to ask permission, because that was not the shape of either Minnie or Pearl, but because he wanted to know if there was anything about what she hoped for her life in Caldwell that he should know before he asked. Pearl had told her about this later, and Minnie had loved him a great deal for it. He said, in the front room of the ranch house with the fire between them, "I want to share my life with you, everything I am and have and intend to build. I know you have your clinic and your work and that they are not secondary to anything else in your life. I am not asking you to give any of it up. I am asking if you would let them all exist together, your work and mine, and us in the middle of it." She looked at him and felt the truth of everything he was and everything she was and everything they were together, clear and steady as the fire. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what I want." He took her hands. He kissed her, slowly and completely, and she held the front of his shirt and kissed him back. And outside the January wind moved through the Kansas grass and the fire crackled, and everything was right. They married in March of 1883, on the first day that could properly be called spring, the grass just beginning to think about green again, and the sky the specific pale blue of a season beginning. The wedding was held in the Caldwell Church, which was a modest building with a good congregation and a minister, Reverend Harris, who had initially been uncertain about Minnie's medical practice, and had become one of her firm defenders after she sat with his wife through a difficult illness in October. Pearl stood beside Minnie. Walt and Danny stood beside Roy. Mayor Hobbs sat in the front pew looking, Minnie thought, like he had just discovered something he had personally arranged, when in fact the primary thing he had done was not stand in the way of it. Roy looked at her when she came down the aisle with the expression she had learned to read as the most honest version of himself, nothing managed, nothing guarded, just the plain fact of what he felt, offered openly. She walked toward him thinking that this was the most important thing she had ever walked toward, which was saying something for a woman who had walked toward a great many important things. Reverend Harris conducted the service with appropriate gravity and appropriate warmth. When Roy said his vows, he said them looking directly at her in that way. He had of making whatever he said feel like something he had known for a long time, and was only now finding the precise language for. When she said hers, she said them with the same steady directness she brought to everything, and she saw in his face that he received them that way too. When they were pronounced man and wife, he kissed her with a restraint that she found characteristically Roy, and she kissed him back with somewhat less restraint, and from the pews came the sound of Pearl laughing, warm and delighted, and Walt saying something to Danny that she could not make out. The celebration after was held in the hotel dining room, the same room where they had had their first dinner, and it had the comfortable warmth of a community celebrating something it had watched develop and was glad to see arrive. There was music from a fiddle and a guitar, and dancing on the cleared floor, and Roy danced with her with the contained, careful precision of a man who does not dance often but is determined to do it properly. And she danced with him, thinking that she had never expected to be dancing in a Caldwell hotel dining room in March, married to this particular man, and that the unexpected nature of it was not the least of its pleasures. They went to the ranch that evening, the two of them, in Roy's wagon under a sky full of cold stars, and Minnie had her arm through his and leaned against his shoulder and looked up at the stars and felt the settled rightness of it in every part of her. "Are you happy?" he said. "I am very happy," she said. "Are you?" "More than I know how to say," he said, "though I will keep trying." She smiled at the stars. "I know you will," she said. Life at the Fletcher Ranch with Minnie's clinic in Caldwell had the shape of something that had been built to work, and it worked. She kept the clinic, which had never been in question, and made the 8-mile ride to town 4 mornings a week, with the 5th morning kept for ranch business and 2 days of proper rest, though the rest was frequently interrupted by necessity. Roy adjusted the ranch's schedule with the same quiet practicality he brought to everything, and the ranch continued to run and improve. Pearl became a fixture in both their lives, appearing at the ranch for Sunday dinner more Sundays than not, becoming the kind of person who occupies a particular category, not quite family by blood, but entirely family by accumulation and choice. Walt recovered full function in his leg, and went on to be one of the most reliable ranch hands in Comanche County, which he had perhaps always been, but which the broken leg had given the opportunity to demonstrate in a new way. Danny Reyes, who was 21 and energetic and had a gift for horses that Roy valued, became a permanent fixture at the ranch. In the summer of 1883, Minnie delivered her first baby in her married life, which was Clara Biggs's second child, and Clara had left the man who had caused her injuries in the spring of that year and was living with her mother and was, carefully and steadily, doing better. The baby was healthy and loud, and Clara named her Rose, and Minnie stood in Clara's mother's house holding Rose in the late afternoon light, and felt the particular privilege of her work in a way that never got smaller no matter how many times she felt it. She told Roy about it that evening, sitting in the front room of the ranch house, and he listened as he always did with his full attention. She told him about Clara and the situation she had come from, without specifics she had no right to share, and about the new baby and the afternoon light, and he reached over and took her hand. "You do remarkable things," he said. "I do ordinary things very consistently," she said. "That is what medicine is." "I know what medicine is," he said. "That is not what I am talking about." She looked at him. He was looking at her with a quality she had seen on particular occasions, when he was saying something he considered important and wanted to make sure it landed. "I am talking about who you are," he said, "not what you do, though the two are not separate." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That is one of the most important things anyone has said to me." "I mean it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why." In October of 1883, Minnie became pregnant. She told Roy on a Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, with the autumn dark outside and the lamp between them making a warm island of the room. She told him plainly, as she told him everything, watching his face. What happened to Roy Fletcher's face in that moment was not something she had words for afterward when she tried to describe it to Pearl. It was not surprise, though there was some. It was not happiness, though there was a great deal of that. It was something more complete than either, a convergence of everything he had been building toward and everything he had not known to expect, landing in him all at once. He got up from his side of the table and came around to her and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands, and then he just looked at her for a moment, and she looked back at him, and the lamp made both their faces golden. "Are you well?" he said finally, first and foremost. "I am very well," she said. "Everything is proceeding exactly as it should." "Good," he said. "Good." And then he pressed his forehead against her hands, and she felt him breathe, and she put one hand in his dark hair, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed saying. Their son was born in the early morning of June the 14th, 1884, in the ranch house, with Minnie herself directing proceedings to the considerable bewilderment and admiration of the Caldwell midwife, Mrs. Abernathy, who had been summoned, and who found the experience of attending a physician's own delivery highly educational. Roy was in the room at Minnie's insistence, which was not common practice in 1884 but which Minnie had precise opinions about, and he held her hand through the long hours of the night and did not flinch once. When it was over and Mrs. Abernathy placed the baby in Minnie's arms, the room was gold with morning light, and the baby was red-faced and emphatic about his feelings in the way of all new babies, and Roy sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at their son with an expression that Minnie filed in the very best category of things she had seen. "He has your determination," Roy said. "He has your lungs," she said. Roy laughed quietly, careful not to startle the baby, and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, tired in a way she had never been tired before and more content than she had words for. They named him James Thomas Fletcher, James for Roy's father and Thomas for no particular reason except that it had the right weight, the right sound when you said it alongside James and Fletcher, a name that fit the territory it was going to be grown in. James Thomas Fletcher turned out to be a child of considerable character. By his first birthday, he was walking with the determined, slightly forward-leaning gait of someone who has somewhere to be. By his second, he was following his father around the ranch with a specific seriousness that Roy found, Minnie could tell, deeply affecting, though he expressed it in the Roy Fletcher manner of saying very little and touching the top of the boy's head occasionally with a hand that could not have been more gentle if it tried. Pearl became James's honorary grandmother with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the role. Walt taught him the names of the horses when he was old enough to ride on Walt's shoulders out to the corral. Danny Rays made him a small lariat out of scrap rope and spent several patient afternoons teaching him to swing it, though the results at age 2 were more enthusiastic than precise. The clinic in Caldwell continued to grow. By 1884, Minnie had treated approximately 200 patients in Caldwell, a number that gave her a quiet satisfaction when she thought about it. The accumulated weight of 200 decisions made well, or at least as well as her knowledge allowed. 200 people who had come to her when they were most vulnerable and trusted her to help. She had lost 3 patients in 2 years, and those losses she held with the particular responsibility of a good doctor who knows that loss is not always failure, but who never stops asking whether there was something else she might have done. She had written 4 letters to Dr. Vance in St. Louis since her arrival in Caldwell, detailed letters about cases she found medically interesting or challenging, and he had written back each time with the responses she remembered from their years together, exact and engaged, and had in his last letter noted that the description of the snakebite case management showed a thorough and practical approach that he had, he said, been telling his current students to emulate. She had read that letter to Roy over dinner, and he had said, with the dry understatement that was one of her favorite things about him, "Justified pride is still allowed." "I know," she said. "I am allowing it." In the spring of 1885, Minnie was invited to speak at the Caldwell Town Council about the need for a proper hospital in the territory. Not a large one, not a city institution, but a proper building with enough beds and enough supply storage and the possibility of more permanent nursing staff to allow her to handle the volume of serious cases the territory generated without running the clinic at the edge of its capacity constantly. She prepared her presentation with the same methodical care she brought to medical procedures. She had 3 years of case records, of patient counts and case types and outcomes, and she laid them out in the clear, organized manner that people who have good data and know how to present it use. She stood before Mayor Hobbs and the 6 council members and made her case without apology and without drama, just the facts, arranged in order, speaking for themselves. The council approved the hospital proposal with 5 votes in favor and 1 abstention, which was considerably better than she had expected. Roy, who was in the room, sitting in the back with his hat on his knee, caught her eye when the vote was announced and gave her a very slight nod. It was the Roy Fletcher equivalent of cheering. Pearl actually cheered, from 2 seats down from Roy. The building of Caldwell's small hospital took most of 1885, and Minnie was involved in every decision about its layout and function, from the placement of the examination rooms to the specification of the water supply to the height of the windows, which she insisted should be high enough to allow ventilation without sacrificing wall space for equipment. The builder, a man named Potts, who had initially considered her input with the patient condescension of a craftsman being directed by someone he did not consider qualified to direct him, came around by the 3rd week when it became clear that she knew exactly what she needed and why, and that her specifications, when he looked at them carefully, were all correct. The hospital opened in January of 1886, and Minnie stood in the front room of it on the morning it opened with a small crowd of Caldwell citizens, and the mayor and Pearl and Roy and James, who was a year and a half old and was being held on his father's hip with the seriousness of someone attending an official ceremony. Minnie cut the ribbon they had hung across the door with a pair of surgical scissors, which she considered appropriate, and when she did there was applause from the gathered crowd that felt, genuinely, like the town acknowledging something it had built together. Roy was beside her afterward in the new front room of the hospital, with James reaching for a glass bottle on the supply shelf that Roy was redirecting with the practiced efficiency of a father of a mobile toddler. "Well, Dr. Fletcher," he said, because he had started calling her that sometimes, not in correction of her name but in recognition of it. "Well, Mr. Fletcher," she said. "What comes next?" he said. She looked around the room, at the space she had argued for and planned and would now run, and then she looked at him, at this man who had needed her and let her help and loved her and built something with her that neither of them could have built alone. "Everything," she said. "Everything comes next." He shifted James to his other hip and reached out and took her hand, and she held it, and outside the Caldwell winter was bright and cold and full of the particular clarity that comes after a long effort, successfully completed. By the spring of 1886, Minnie was pregnant again. She told Roy in the same way she had told him the first time, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening, watching his face. His face did the same thing it had done with James, that convergence of things landing all at once, though this time there was less of the overwhelm and more of the warmth, because he knew now what it was coming toward, and so did she. "Are you well?" he said, first and foremost again, as she had known he would. "Perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said, and came around the table, and this time she stood to meet him. Their second child was born in November of 1886, another boy, which made Roy laugh with surprise and delight when Minnie told him, because they had both somehow expected a daughter without quite saying so. They named him William Pearl Fletcher, the Pearl for the woman who had been there from the beginning, who cried when they told her the baby's middle name, and then denied crying with energetic conviction. William Fletcher turned out to be a different person from his brother entirely, which was appropriate. Where James was his father's kind of serious and methodical, William was all Minnie's directness and curiosity, exploring everything at high speed and expressing opinions about his discoveries with an enthusiasm that began to manifest in actual words by the time he was 10 months old. Roy watched William with the delighted bewilderment of a parent encountering a temperament that is genuinely new to them. "He will either be a scientist or a disaster," Roy said, watching William systematically empty a kitchen drawer at 11 months. "Or both," Minnie said, from across the room where she was stitching a tear in one of Roy's shirts with the same neat, economical stitches she used for everything. "Probably both," Roy agreed. Pearl came for Sunday dinners and holidays and whenever she felt like it, which was often. Walt's leg remained solid and he ran the north field with the authority of long experience. Danny Reyes, who had gotten married in 1885 to a woman named Josephine from a ranch south of Caldwell, had a daughter now and brought her out to the Fletcher Ranch on Sundays with the comfortable ease of someone who knows he belongs in a place. The territory was changing around them, as territories do. Caldwell was becoming less wild and more settled, the cattle trade shifting in character as the range became more fenced, and the open drives of the early years gave way to different methods. New families came in, homesteaders establishing on the free land grants, bringing their children and their different needs, and Minnie's hospital served all of them, the cattlemen and the homesteaders and the traveling workers and the established families, without distinction. She had a conversation with a Kiowa woman named Taya in the spring of 1887 that she thought about for a long time afterward. Taya had come to the hospital with an injured son, cautious and watchful in the way of someone who has learned to expect hostility in such spaces, and Minnie had treated the boy with the same attention she gave every patient, and Taya had sat and watched her, and by the time the boy was bandaged and comfortable, Taya had begun to talk. What she said, carefully and through the particular English that was her second language, was about the indignities of the territory as it settled, the pressures on her people from every direction, the loss of land and hunting ranged to the same steady encroachment that Minnie could see in the increased fencing and the new homesteads appearing on what had been open ground. Minnie listened. She could not fix what Taya was describing, and she did not pretend to. But she listened with genuine attention, and she thought that sometimes, though not always, that was the beginning of something better than nothing. She told Roy about the conversation that evening. He was quiet for a while afterward. "My father bought this land fair and paid for it," he said slowly. "But I know that what was available to buy was available because it was taken from someone first. I don't know what the right answer to that is, except to not pretend it didn't happen." "That is more honest than most," she said. "It is not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "But it is a start." He thought about that for a while in the Roy Fletcher way, going still and deep into it, and she let him think. In the years that followed, Roy made a point of treating the native traders and workers who passed through their part of the territory with the straightforward respect he gave everyone, and in the small practical ways available to him, the access to water on his land, the fair wages for any work, the simple decency of seeing people as people, he tried to do what he could. It was not a solution to an injustice that was larger than any single man's choices. But it was honest, and it was consistent, and Minnie loved him the more for taking it seriously. James Fletcher started school in Caldwell in 1889, walking into the schoolhouse on his first day with the same slightly forward-leaning walk his father had, and the same steady gray eyes. His teacher, Miss Hartley, reported after the first week that James was serious, attentive, and occasionally gave answers that suggested he had been reading considerably beyond his age level. This was because Roy had been reading to him since he was old enough to hold a book, including, as James reported to Minnie with the casual informality of a child unaware of social nuance, the poetry book. Minnie told Roy this, and he put his face briefly into his hands, and she laughed. "He is going to love books," she said when Roy emerged. "You gave him that." "He can love books," Roy said. "He does not need to announce the poetry. Poetry is nothing to be ashamed of," she said. "I know that," he said. "I am not ashamed of it. I am," he paused, "private about it." "There is a difference," she agreed generously. William started school 2 years after James, loudly and with extreme opinions about everything he encountered there, which Miss Hartley handled with the adaptable patience of a teacher who had been teaching in a frontier town long enough to have seen everything. Within a month, William had reorganized the classroom's bookshelf according to a system that made sense only to him, and had gotten into 2 arguments about arithmetic, both of which he had technically won, and had discovered a best friend in the son of one of the newer homesteading families, a boy named Eli Marsh, who was the only person in the class who could keep up with William's particular energy. Roy and Minnie sat on their porch in the October evenings of 1889 and watched the sun go down over the Kansas grass and talked about their sons and the ranch and the hospital and the territory and the 100 small and large things that constitute a life being built together. And those evenings had the quality of something she had not always known she was looking for, and had found anyway. The specific contentment of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing, with the person they are supposed to be doing it with. One evening Roy said, out of a comfortable silence that had gone on for several minutes, "Do you remember when you told me, the first time I was at the clinic, that I would come to it eventually?" She thought. "I said something like that to Pearl," she said. "Not to you directly. Meaning what I said to Pearl was reported back to me." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the sunset, but the corners of his mouth were doing something. "Pearl is very thorough," she said. "What I was going to say," he said, "was that you were right. I did come to it eventually, and everything after that has been the best thing that ever happened to me." She looked at the sunset. It was a very good one, the kind that turned the flat land into something that looked like art. "You were the last person in town to ask me for help," she said, "and the most important one." He turned and looked at her, and after 7 years of learning his face she could read everything in that look. All of it. The man who taped his own ribs with canvas strips and sat up through the night with a stranger's fever and asked her to dinner on a July afternoon with his hat in his hands, all of it present and clear. "I love you," he said, plain and solid, the same way he had always said it. "I love you," she said back, the same way she always had. The October evening settled around them, warm and full of the insect sound of a late Kansas autumn, and the light went slowly gold and then amber, and then the soft, particular blue of dusk on the prairie, and the stars came out one at a time over the flat horizon, the same stars she had seen on the night they drove home from their wedding, and she thought about all of it. About the stagecoach steps and the mercantile and waltz leg, and the cottonwood shade, and the clinic door and the hotel dining room, and the wedding and the boys asleep inside the house, and the ranch and the hospital and the years ahead that she could not see but that felt, from where she was sitting, entirely worth looking forward to. Roy reached over and took her hand in the dark, as he had reached for her hand in the cottonwood shade, as he had held her hand through James's long birth night, as he had taken her hands the evening she told him she was carrying William, as he had done on 100 evenings and would do on 100 more. She held his hand, and the stars came out over Kansas, and everything was complete.